Okay, we would like to turn to the book of Numbers, chapter 21. Book of Numbers, chapter 21. We'll read the first 9 verses. When King Arad, the Canaanite, which dwelt in the south, heard tell that Israel came by way of the spies, and he fought against Israel, and took some of them prisoners. And Israel vowed a vow unto the Lord, and said, If thou wilt indeed deliver this people into my hand, then I will utterly destroy their cities. And the Lord hearkened to the voice of Israel, and delivered up the Canaanites, and they utterly destroyed them and their cities, and he called the name of the place Hormah. And they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to compass the land of Edom, and the soul of the people was much discouraged because of the way. And the people spake against God and against Moses, Wherefore have ye brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no bread, neither is there any water, and our soul loatheth this light bread. And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much people of Israel died. Therefore the people came to Moses and said, We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against thee. Pray unto the Lord that he take away the serpents from us. And Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said unto Moses, Make thee a fiery serpent, set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that every one that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live. And Moses made a serpent of brass, put it upon a pole, just as God had said. And it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. What we read here took place at near the end of Israel's 40-year journey through the wilderness. During that 40 years of wandering, God was faithful to walk with Israel, to feed them every day with manna, to faithfully lead them from place to place. But the Israelites had grown tired of their wandering. They had actually grown tired of God's plan. They had grown tired of God's provided manna. And they had grown tired of their leader, Moses. And in verse 4, we're told that and they journeyed from Mount Hor by way of the Red Sea to compass the land of Edom. They were forced this way because the Edomites would not grant them permission to cross their land into Canaan. And that, of course, forced Israel to walk through a terribly harsh desert area that was very rough, very desolate, mountainous. And this brought discouragement to the people. And the soul of the people was much discouraged because of the way. So they're tired. They are impatient concerning their destination. Their frustration has grown by the day as they're being forced to walk through this wilderness. And this brings to surface the condition of their hearts, and we see this in their complaints. So we read in verse 5, in spite of God's grace in delivering them from Egypt, in spite of God's gracious provision in feeding and guiding them, they voice several complaints. Their complaints reveal the coldness of their hearts, the corruption of their minds. Notice verse 5. They were against God. We read this, they spake against God. They spake against God. They were also against God's man for them and against Moses. They rebelled against and thought lightly of God's promise. We hear them say, wherefore have ye brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? They also rebelled against and thought lightly of God's provision. They said, there is no bread, neither is there any water. But then notice what they say. And our soul loatheth, our soul is disgusted by this light bread, this worthless bread, referring to the manna. So they looked at the manna as nothing, as worthless. That's why they said, there is no bread. And yet they despised, or their soul loatheth, this light, this worthless bread. What God has given us here in the wilderness is worthless. So here is a people in rebellion against God, rebellion against His goodness toward them. And in response to their rebellious ungratefulness, God sends judgment upon them in the form of fiery serpents, poisonous snakes. In verse 6, we read the words, fiery serpents among the people. They are called fiery because of the pain that they inflicted. And then we read, and they, the fiery serpents, bit the people. The result, and much of Israel died. These fiery serpents bit the people. As a result, many had died, and many were dying, and many were in danger of dying. Paul makes reference to this by way of warning. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 9, he says, and were destroyed of serpents. Again, fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much people of Israel died. This is a situation of great fear. This is a situation of panic and distress. The people come to Moses in verse 7, whom they had spoken against, and they plead with Moses, pray unto the Lord. Why didn't they pray? Because they really couldn't. They weren't in a condition to do so. That He take away the serpents from us. And then we read, and Moses prayed for the people. That's quite an example. Moses, the leader of the people of God, rose above the ill treatment that he had received because they were against Moses, and he prayed for the people. In verse 8, God gave Moses the remedy. for a snake-bitten people. And the Lord said unto Moses, Make thee a fiery serpent, and set it upon a pole. And it shall come to pass that every one that is bitten when he looketh upon shall live. There is a God remedy for the awful plague of sin. And the remedy that God gave to Moses was a type of Christ. We read in John 3 and verse 14, And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, Jesus says, Even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And the people beholding, not just looking, but beholding, the serpent of brass upon a pole, were healed. And that, of course, is a picture of salvation, picture of the deliverance from the curse. In this message, we want to look at this event. We want to make application to the saved. And we want to center our thoughts upon verse 6, fiery serpents among the people. The subject is living among poisonous snakes. So let's consider, first of all, these serpents, these snakes. Fiery serpents among the people. That speaks of great danger. Then we read they bit the people. Then we read of the tragedy of it, and much of Israel died. By this time, there's well over 2 million people, and much of Israel died. Much of over 2 million people died. So it's very obvious that there was an abundance of these fiery serpents. No doubt they were everywhere. They were on the ground. You'd have to be very careful where you walked. They were in the bushes. They were in the wood piles. They were beneath things. They were behind things. They would get in the tents of the people. Everywhere you went, there were these poisonous snakes that could strike at any time. Fiery serpents among the people. Everyone was in danger. Everyone. Because these fiery serpents, they could be anywhere. They could strike anyone at any time. And it's still true today. Fiery serpents among the people. And these were the people of God. And it's still true today. Fiery serpents among the people of God. And they bit the people. Many of God's people, much of God's people, are snake bitten. As God's people, we must live in the awareness that there are fiery serpents everywhere. Imagine his news spread. So-and-so, they were just walking along and they got bit by a snake and they died. And these stories would increase as time went on. Eventually, everyone would be looking as they took each step. They would be afraid to move anything You don't know what's underneath. You don't know what's behind it. We must live in the awareness that there are fiery serpents. And we are vulnerable to their bite and their venom. Venom is an immobilizing substance. It is toxic, deadly saliva. Venom. There are two general types of toxins in venom. There are neurotoxins. They, of course, attack the central nervous system, resulting in breathing difficulties and finally heart failure. And there are hemotoxins. They attack the circulatory system, the muscle tissue, causing the disuse of motor skills, crippling and paralyzing the individuals. Some snakes have both of these toxins in their venom. And if you get bit, you're in trouble. Also associated with these toxins would be swelling, discoloration at the site of the bite, nausea, vomiting, fever, excruciating stomach cramping, convulsions, extreme thirst, and paralysis. And they bit the people, and much people died. Can you imagine what was going on amongst the people of God? Again, the fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much people of Israel died. That presents a picture of terrible suffering. It is a scene that is grievous. It is a scene that is agonizing. It is a traumatic situation. So picture the scene. You have infants that have been bitten. You have young children. You have siblings. You have fathers. You have mothers. You have spouses. Bitten by these poisonous snakes. And as a result, many have died. Did infants die? I believe so. Did young children die? I believe so. Did the elderly die? I believe so. Much people died, of well over 2 million. Imagine the sobbing. Imagine the wailing all over the camp. Picture the father and mother desperately caring for a young child that has been bitten, or a spouse attending to their mate. There's sadness in the camp. There's gloom in that camp. These poisonous serpents these fiery serpents are everywhere in the camp. Imagine the worry as you went into your tent, lay down to sleep. Imagine the worry. Imagine the fear as you walked out of the tent. So imagine the worry and the fear that gripped the hearts of the people. Because anywhere you stepped, there could be a fiery serpent ready to strike. Anything you moved, there might be a fiery serpent lurking behind or underneath, ready to inflict its deadly venom. Imagine the chaos in that camp. So let's consider what all this typifies. In verse 6, there are two things. Number one, fiery serpents among the people. A serpent is a very appropriate figure of the deadly destructive power of sin. Number two, and they bit the people. And really, third thing, and much people of Israel died. Which is a picture of the consequences of sin. Again, venom is an immobilizing substance. Toxic, deadly saliva. And sin is the most deadly of all venom. Nothing more dangerous than sin. It impacts, it paralyzes every part of man, infecting all that belongs to man. And like venom, sin does not just impact the area of attack. You reach your hand in the woodpile and the fiery serpent strikes your hand. The hand is not the only infected area. That venom spreads throughout the body. And so it is with sin. Sin is a deadly serpent. We read in Genesis 1, verse 31, that God looked upon what He had created and He said it was very good. Nothing out of order. No conflict, no struggle, no pain, no disease, no death. But in Genesis 3, the serpent of sin struck, and everything changes, resulting in a deadly decline. And from Genesis 3, throughout the Old Testament, we read of betrayal, deception, rage, adultery, polygamy, theft, idolatry, anger, ruthlessness, hatred, jealousy, the selling into slavery, harlotry, genocide, child sacrifice, cannibalism, famines, disasters, plague after plague, disease upon disease, and death. Quite a change from, and God saw everything that He made, and behold, it was very good. Wherever there is sin, there is damage. You may not see it, but there is damage. Wherever there is sin, there is destruction. Wherever there is sin, there is devastation. Wherever there is sin, there is loss. There is havoc. There is misery. This is illustrated by the many maladies and disabilities that Christ healed during His earthly ministry. They all picture the power of sin. You take the cases of demon possession. They illustrate the enslaving and controlling power of sin. You take the cases of blindness. They illustrate the blinding power of sin. You take the cases of leprosy. They illustrate the spreading power of sin. You take the cases of fever, and they illustrate the restlessness that sin causes. You take the cases of paralysis, and they illustrate the crippling power of sin. You take the cases of the deaf, and they illustrate the effect that sin has upon the hearing. And you take the cases of begging, and they illustrate the stripping power of sin. All the venom of sin. It affects man physically. It affects his mental state, his emotional state, and of course his spiritual well-being. It's dreadful. It degrades human character. It wastes human bodies. It decimates civilizations. The history of the world is a history of the suffering that sin brings, of the trouble that sin brings, of the pain and the agony and the sorrow that sin has caused. Every sin is like that poisonous serpent. There are many species of this deadly serpent. Perhaps the most deadly of all, there is the serpent of pride. It's everywhere. And it can strike at any moment, immobilizing you spiritually. There is the serpent of self-righteousness. They're everywhere. They can strike at any moment. There's the serpent of self. There's the serpent of bitterness. There is the serpent of jealousy. There is the serpent of anger. The serpent of impatience. The serpent of murmuring. The serpent of discouragement. The serpent of worldliness. The serpent of covetousness. The serpent of hardness and apathy. Or the serpents of doubt and unbelief. These fiery serpents, they slither about. They're everywhere. And they can strike without warning. And they do so with powerful and disabling effect. Beware of the snakes. We live in a snake-infested world. Be careful where you step. Beware of the snakes, fiery serpents among the people. And their venom is lethal. Their venom is life-threatening. And they're everywhere. These vipers with their lethal, life-threatening, painful, burning venom, they lurk in the woodpiles of man's philosophy, of man's opinions. Man's philosophy and man's opinions are nesting places for these poisonous snakes. They lurk in the television, the radio, the computer. They're in social media. They're in books. They're in magazines. Beware of the snakes. They can lurk anywhere. Even when you walk in the house of God, you may think this is a safe place. I'm here to tell you that there are fiery serpents that slither through church buildings. And they can strike at any moment with deadly accuracy. Beware of the snakes. They are in our circumstances. They are in our houses. They are in our churches. They are in the workplace. They are in marriages. Many a spouse have been snake bitten. They are in relationships. They are in the streets everywhere you go. They're everywhere. And they strike with pinpoint accuracy. And they can strike at any time, paralyzing and disabling its victim, rendering them spiritually powerless. Oh, that we would realize how many, again we see much of the people of Israel died. And how many of God's people today are spiritually powerless because they've been disabled by sin. Beware of the snakes. And every single time you witness someone being bit by a snake, or you hear of someone being bitten by this snake, it should serve as a warning. Be careful. Be careful. Again, these poisonous vipers are ready to strike, injecting deadly venom. They strike with numbing potency. Beware of the snakes. They strike with immobilizing velocity and accuracy. Beware of the snakes. When they strike, their venom can spread through your entire system. Beware of the snakes. They can be anywhere. But there are also places where you know that there are snakes. There are places you know this is a place where there are snakes. Keep your distance from their common lurking places. Don't go into a snake-infested area. And don't play with the snakes. Most of us don't have to be told, don't play with poisonous snakes. But we all have to be told, don't play with sin. And sin is worse than any poisonous snake. And it is more foolish to play with sin than it is to play with a poisonous snake. Beware of the snakes. Don't play around the areas where you know they lurk. You see a field and you see a sign, snake-infested area. You going to go for a walk with your children through that area? I sure hope not. Hope you got more sense than that. But yet God's people do it all the time with sin. Be careful everywhere, at all times, for they can be anywhere. They can be anywhere. As God's people, we must live in the awareness that there are fiery serpents everywhere. And we are vulnerable to their bite. Paul exhorted the Ephesians in Ephesians 5, verse 11. He said, see. That is, make certain, see to it, that ye, that's personal, walk or live circumspectly, or carefully, cautiously, on guard, watchful, alert, attentive, with vigilance. We're to be careful. Why? Because there are poisonous snakes everywhere, ready to strike. Be careful where you walk. As you walk, be watching. Be alert in all things, because there are fiery serpents everywhere ready to strike. Walk circumspectly. All through the Word of God we read such words: beware, watch, awake, take heed. All of those words are telling us, are sending the same message. Be careful. Be careful. Because these snakes are everywhere. Thirdly, what to do when snake bitten. We've all been bitten with these snakes. In our text, we read fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people. They bit the people. They bit many people, because much of Israel died. When one of these fiery serpents strike, I wouldn't advise ignoring it. Yet that's what we do. Well, it's just a snake. It's just venom. I'll just ignore it and go on. When one of these fiery serpents strike, don't pretend that it didn't happen. You'll die. Don't pretend it didn't happen. Don't pretend that you're better than you are. I'm okay, I'm okay. I've been bit before. Don't let anyone tell you that it's okay. You're walking with somebody and they get bit by a rattlesnake, and you say, don't worry about it, you're okay. Are you going to do that? No, I don't think so. But yet that's the advice that God's people give to other of God's people. Don't worry about it. That's happened to a lot of people. It's not okay. When you get bit by one of these snakes, it's not okay. When you sin, it's not okay. Well, the circumstances change things. I don't care what your circumstances are. You get bit by a poisonous serpent, it doesn't much matter what your circumstances are. And so it is with sin. When one of these fiery serpents strike, don't seek out the snake oils of men. Oh, I've got a cure for that. I've got something that'll help that. There is a God remedy for the snake bitten. In verse 7, we read of the people, no doubt overwhelmed and filled with sorrow and misery and fear. We see that they're convicted. They cry, we have sinned. We have sinned. And then they confess their sin. We have spoken against the Lord. They're needs to be an acknowledgement. When we're snake bitten, there needs to be an acknowledgement. We have sinned. And then there needs to be a confession of the particular sin. And then notice there's contrition. They say unto Moses, pray unto the Lord. We have sinned. And they look to the Lord as a solution. And there is desire that He take away the serpents. That should be our prayer. We have sinned. Oh, that God would take away the sin. So the people, some of them with swollen and parched mouths, plead with Moses to ask God to take away the serpents. And Moses prayed for the people. And in answer to his prayer, God instructed Moses what to do to remedy the plague. He told him to take a piece of brass and make thee a fiery serpent. He would do this by beating that brass into the form of a serpent. And then he was to put it upon a pole so all could see. That pole gave the Israelites a direction to look to. Moses would hold up that pole. And the Israelites would lift up their hearts. And what would they see? They would see a serpent of brass upon a pole. Why a serpent? Why not an angel? Why not a dove or some other holy symbol? Why a serpent? Well, a serpent is a cursed thing. Go back to Genesis 3. Make thee a fiery serpent and set it upon a pole. This is a type of Christ. It is declared in Galatians 3, verse 13, Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of law, being made a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is every one that hangeth on a tree. That serpent upon a pole is a picture of Christ being made a curse for us upon the cross. Christ is the remedy. There is no other remedy. God's people need to be reminded of this. We can go back to our salvation and we know that Christ was the remedy for our sins. But God's people seem to forget that as their saved life progresses. Jesus Christ is still the remedy for sin. And when we sin, we are to look to Christ. We're to look to Him. So fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people. As a result, many have died. Others are dying. Many are suffering excruciating pain. They have fever. They have paralysis. They're parched with thirst. They're all in grave danger. There are no hospitals. There are no doctors. There are no anti-venom drugs. And there was nothing they could do to save themselves. This was a desperate situation. But with that brass serpent upon the pole, and they weren't just to look to it, they were to behold it. They were to behold it. Their hope is aroused. There's hope! And their hope is in what was represented upon that pole. We read in verse 9, and it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, notice that, any man, didn't matter who it was. When he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of fevered, pain, wrecked, dying, snake-bitten victims healed and restored to life. If a serpent had bitten any man, when he, the bitten, beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. And all the joy that went through that camp when those who were snake-bitten looked believingly upon the serpent of brass, and their burning and intense pain subsided. And the swelling went away. And the discoloration of the snake bit area went away. And the nausea and the vomiting and the stomach cramping and the convulsions and the thirst, they're all gone. And health was imparted. And it was all due to God's remedy. And so it is today. Let's say someone was bitten and they look to that serpent upon the pole and they're healed. The next day they're bitten again. What do you think he did? He looked to that serpent upon that pole. No matter how many times they were bitten, they looked to what represented Jesus Christ. And no matter how many times we're bitten, no matter how many times we sin, look to Christ. Because He is the remedy. There were people who were bitten more than once. And we sin. We have sinned. We do sin, and we will continue to sin. But the remedy is Christ. Christ is always the remedy. So when you and I sin, look to Christ. He's the only remedy against the venom of sin. We can come up with all the plans we want to. We can come up with all the programs we want to. But there is not a plan, there is not a program that is going to fix the sin problem. And that's man's biggest problem. It's Christ. It's Christ. World War II was the war to end all wars. Didn't happen that way. You know why? Sin. There's a sin problem. Nobody can fix the sin problem other than Christ. This program will end all poverty. No, it won't. Because there's a problem that you cannot fix. The sin problem. Oh, we come up with this program and it'll put an end to all crime. Don't be a fool. There's a thing called sin. And only the Lord can fix that. He's the only remedy. My point is, don't look to ourselves, don't look to others, don't look to anyone or anything to fix the sin problem. Only Christ. Only Christ. There is remission of sin. There is the taking away of sin. There's the covering of sin in the blood of Jesus Christ. There is healing. There is restoration. There is cleansing from the awful plague of sin. It's not in religion. It's not in programs. It's not in opinions. It's not in plans. It is in Jesus Christ. So when snake bitten, look to Christ. He's the answer. Brother Ben, if you'd come and lead us in a verse of song. Let's all stand as we sing.